space, I think the first thing that we're going to do is just welcome everybody. Thank you again for attending. Recognize some names on the list, which means several of you have been here multiple times throughout the year. We definitely appreciate you coming back. I appreciate that my presentation style of dry sarcasm hasn't scared everybody away just yet. So what we're going to talk about is video on demand technologies. And anytime that I go through and do these webinars, I anticipate that we're going to have a wide array of technological expertise on the presentation. So I prepare them so that they become, we tell the story at the beginning of where we started and why this is even something that the market needs to do, and then kind of progress all the way through to where we are now. So what you're going to see as we go through this webinar is all of our prior use cases, how service providers have reacted to these requirements over the years and the changes that they've made. Then I'm going to focus specifically on healthcare video on demand, because that's where a lot of our client base lies. That's where several of you that are on this webinar, that's where you make your living. But then I'll also get into K through 12 and enterprise kind of commercial technologies as well, and what we're seeing in that space. I chose healthcare to kind of focus on because that is, at least in terms of commercial applications, where you see the most video on demand interaction outside of the obvious hospitality space when you're like in your hotel room and logging on to your Netflix accounts and Amazon accounts that way. So that's kind of the flow that we'll go through today. I anticipate that this will be in that 30-minute range, just like so many of our other presentations have been. And so this slide, this is the original video on demand system, right? This is the godfather, the granddaddy of video on demand. And I kid you not, my youngest daughter will turn 8 in November. She was born in a hospital here in Washington County, Maryland. And after she was born, they did what they do. They took her away. The nurse rolled in a crash cart complete with VCR and popped in the purple crying video, reminding you how you're supposed to handle the baby and what you do when they have those nights that they're just inconsolable because they're gassy or whatever. But this is video on demand, right? Like this is where VOD started. And what I really found interesting as I was putting together this presentation and as I was doing the research to put together this presentation is that the applications and the interest for video on demand were there 10, 15, 20 years before we actually had the technology to do it the way that we do it today. And this is a perfect example of that. My mom was a huge Friends fan, huge Friends fan. And so we, every Thursday, if we were going out, if we had rec league basketball, or if I had practice, we had to run the sports, whatever. We had to make sure that we set the VCR to record Friends, so that we didn't miss the episode of Friends, because that in the 90s, right? That's the era that I grew up in. Graduated high school in 2002, which makes me older than I feel. That was what you had to do. There was no Netflix. There was no streaming. Your VOD was the ability for you to schedule and record your own content, or to put together something like this and go out and actually, buy a DVD, buy a VHS tape, and that's video on demand, right? Like that's the precursor to the technologies that we have now. And it was really interesting as I was putting this together to just kind of look at this and realize that we have had this need, this requirement for video on demand, this desire to watch content when we want to watch it for a long time, far longer than we've had the technology to support it in the way that we do today. So because that desire was there, because that's what their customer base wanted, what you eventually saw was service providers react to this by allocating this space that you see down here in the bottom left-hand corner. And I'm going to pop on my laser pointer real quick. That way I can point to things. You see in the bottom left-hand corner is cable service providers, rather than UHF, VHF channels 2 through 25, which was just straight broadcast, right? You got it, and that was what you got. They allocated this upstream space so that now you could start to make requests. Think early pay-per-view, like WWF events back in the day, movies, video on demand. All that was happening there is we were making that request on this upstream 5 through 42 megahertz frequency range that was allocated for communicating back from your cable provider set-top box to whatever their system was, their CMTS on the back end, to make those requests or to change your programming information so that you could get additional channels. The problem that we ran into, DOCSIS 2.0, DOCSIS 3.0, is this isn't enough bandwidth for where we were headed, right? When I say 5 to 42 megahertz, those are center frequencies. Each RF frequency is roughly 6 megahertz wide. Each 6 megahertz wide RF frequency can carry 38.8 megabits of data. So you are looking at, if you've got 5 to 42 there, about 6 megahertz wide channels, each of them capable of carrying roughly 40 megabits per second of data. So you really can't carry that much data back upstream in this 5 through 42 megahertz environment absent channel bonding. There wasn't a lot of capability there to start pushing video back up, or in an enterprise environment to have a bunch of people making these video on demand requests or start sending this information back upstream. So what the carriers did is they iterated on the DOCSIS standard and allowed for more space to come back up. And what I really wanted to point out here on this slide as you're going through this DOCSIS evolution is they demarked very clearly where the upstream and downstream dividing marker is, right? This is everything that's coming back to the service provider. This is everything that is space for you to be sent content. Same thing here. And then as we transition to DOCSIS 3.1, you see that they moved that up. So there's more area allocated for reverse path, and there's a lot more area allocated in DOCSIS 3.1 for actual downstream data and downstream information. And really what's going on here is this requirement for data services that we have, for video on demand services, for streaming platforms, everything else is driving this change. And then this change is driving the technologies that need to work within this space. And everything right now that we deal with on the RF side of things comes from this requirement to free up more space for video data. And I dive into it a little bit more in the back end of the presentation. But right now, Ericsson estimates that up to 70% of the cell data that they process on their cell networks is video data. And they anticipate that jumping up significantly over the next 5 years. Cisco has similar white papers that are out there that we'll get into. But really what this has caused and what it causes a complication is this dividing line is something that needs to be managed and monitored within your television systems, whether this is a coax system, whether this is a Z-band system. If you're communicating RF and using an RF system, this change in where they put the diplexer and where we changed upstream communications to downstream communications requires an infrastructure upgrade, right? Because if I have a cable set-top box out at the edge and it's a DOCSIS 3.0 set-top box, which is communicating in these frequency ranges, what it has within it, or what your infrastructure has within it, your reverse path amplifiers, all the kind of fun stuff, are diplexers. And what they do is they open this reverse path channel when they receive communications or when they see communications that says, hey, I want to go talk back to the CMTS, right? And the reason that is, and I think I touched on it in a bullet in the previous slide, is if you leave that communications channel open permanently, any noise that gets injected into your system, whether that is just through OTA frequencies that you're picking up, whether it's because somebody ran your coax plant next to a generator and you just got a bunch of electrical hum coming in, whatever. But any noise that you get introduced into your coaxial cable system as an enterprise customer or even as a residential client, without this diplexer, if this reverse path communication is always open, that also gets injected back into the cable service providers' inside plant, outside plant infrastructure, or their HFC infrastructure. And that's problematic. So what you have throughout a lot of coax infrastructures, or basically any coax infrastructure that was designed with reverse path in mind, is amplifiers being the big ones, but some other components, active components within coax distribution systems, where they have a very specific frequency range on their diplexer, and you have to swap out all of that equipment if you're going to make a transition from DOCSIS 3.0 to DOCSIS 3.1, and in the future from DOCSIS 3.1 to DOCSIS 4.0. So when you have this conversation with service providers, they have this like massive inside plant, outside plant upgrade that's kind of constantly ongoing and has been ongoing for the last several years, so that they can roll out these technologies. And again, it's all being driven by this idea that we are consuming more video data. We're consuming more video data in our social media. We're consuming more video data in our streaming platforms. And I mean, we're just a very screen heavy society at this point in time. So we need to constantly be opening up more and more data pathways for us to be able to communicate back, and for also for information to be sent our direction. The other thing that's interesting that's going on behind the scenes here, as we're talking about video on demand, and it'll be relevant as we get into kind of some of the streaming side of things, is we're getting much, much better with compression technologies, right? And everyone is on the call is probably familiar with, from a terminology standpoint, MPEG-2 and, you know, MPEG-1 for audio, or AAC for audio, as early iterations of video compression technologies. And then we jumped from MPEG-2 to MPEG-4 or H.264, depending on how you prefer to phrase it. And then we went to H.265 or HEVC, and now in development is H.266 or VVC, which is versatile video coding, which is supposed to be, depending on the encoding or decoding side of things, somewhere between 2 and 5 times as powerful as your H.265 HEVC compression technologies are. So while we're doing all of this work with DOCSIS to move our data around and open up additional data pathways, on the back end, these same clients and customers and service providers that are changing around this infrastructure are working on getting better at compressing the data and storing it in a smaller form factor and transporting it in a smaller form factor, so that we can fit more data within, or more video within, that like 6 megahertz space. Because as you can see, even as we're talking about here, all of my graphs are dealing with frequency ranges, megahertz ranges, and it's an odd thing to think about, but all of the internet that comes into your house as RF, right? It comes into your house channel bonded on these RF frequency ranges, and then your modem decides, okay, this is the TV service part of it, we're going to put out the coax, and then this is the data part of it that we're going to put out as IP. And it's more complicated than that, obviously, but I'm generalizing just to kind of to make the point that what we're doing with video distribution technologies right now, with video on demand requests, even the stuff that's coming into your house and is streaming IP when it's into your house, it's getting there on RF frequencies that are bonded with each other that allow you to carry a ton of data. And I want to go back and just kind of touch on that, because as we were talking about in that first slide, all of these RF frequencies are 6 megahertz wide. And in the analog world that I grew up in, like I said, graduated high school in 2002, born in 1984, just old enough to had to have physically turned the knob on the television to change from channel 2 to channel 3 to channel 4. That's what you were doing at that point in time. When you were changing from channel 2 to channel 3, you were actually functionally changing the frequency that you were tuning into on your television. And that 6 megahertz wide frequency range could carry one program. You could watch CBS or ABC or NBC, and that was it. That was everything that was on that program. Now, in this environment here, in this DOCSIS 3.1, DOCSIS 4.0, DOCSIS 3.0 environment, that same 6 megahertz wide channel is actually able to contain 15, 20, 1080p or 720p quality programs. It can contain a full 4K HEVC program. And that's what you see when you're, at a hotel or at your house and you're 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. That's the three, the major number there is the RF frequency that you're on. And then the dot one, dot two, dot three is a minor number that's actually deciding which little program within that 6 megahertz wide carrier you want to select. And all of this is being done. All of this is being done in the service of opening up more bandwidth for video data. And this is kind of, I've been harping on it here, but that's where this presentation is leading, right? We started with these video on demand systems that were a crash cart, and then you were able to make requests over your coax infrastructure to go back to the service provider to pull a program or two at a time. And then now, because of how much data we can put in these DOCSIS 3.0, DOCSIS 3.1 systems, everything is basically network at this point. And there are some specific applications when I get into healthcare and stuff a little later in the presentation where that's still not true. But for the most part, now as we look at things in 2023 and beyond, VOD systems are IPTV. And what I really thought was cool about this, as I was, again, going back through and doing the research for this, these are so much newer than what I realized, right? Netflix's transition from we sell DVD rental services to we sell streaming services began in 2007, the same year that they shipped their billionth DVD. By 2010, they had actually started to go out and acquire reasonable amounts of content. And one of the reason that Walter White is on the screen right now is one of the first big pieces of content that they acquired was Breaking Bad. And Breaking Bad was acquired, I think, between season 3 and season 4, or season 2 and season 3. Either way, those seasons went on Netflix. The Netflix viewership that picked up Breaking Bad then joined the live viewership for AMC at the beginning of, I believe it was season 4. And this was a show that history doesn't remember this, but if you go back and kind of read through things and do the research on it, Breaking Bad was on the ropes a little bit, right? Like, it's regarded now as one of the better shows of this generation. It's the first like binge-worthy show that Netflix actually had, but it was on the ropes. It wasn't getting great live viewership because even by 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, our viewership habits as far as how we consume television had already started to change. And this is what VOD is now, right? I've been very much looking at this through a residential lens because it helps me describe the technology and lay the foundations a little bit better. But the way that we view VOD in the residential environment has very much informed the expectations for what we have when we want to do video on demand in our commercial environments, healthcare, enterprise, government, whatever. So this change that came about by just being allowed to pack more data into the same amount of space as what we were before has actually been what has enabled the VOD expansion that we have, this like streaming world that we live in now. I don't know if any of these companies are ever going to be profitable. That's a different story, but at least the technology is there now. The other cool thing about this is just going to continue growing, right? The things that we think of as video on demand applications are just going to continue to expand. You've already seen from Netflix a couple of like interactive episodes of Black Mirror and shows like that where you get to choose the ending as the client. Everybody's out there working on 8K technologies, virtual reality technologies, augmented reality technologies. And the more of this that we develop, Cisco, Ericsson, pick a data-led company that is doing white papers and forecasting into the future on this stuff, and they're just expecting more and more and more content to be video as these systems expand. And so how do they work? Like, that's the big thing. And what's the difference between putting these in like a residential environment versus an enterprise environment? This is one of the things that we struggle with, frankly, when we have conversations with customers, because broadcast content, whether it's multicast content from your service provider or whether it's kind of the traditional RF content, is a push from the service provider. They are saying, here you go, here's the TV content. And this is referred to, you see it here on the slide, as linear television. Linear television is basically anything that like I'm an Orioles fan, so it's a good year. We've had some rough ones. I'm going to celebrate and kind of enjoy it while I can. Uh, the Orioles' first pitch is at 6:35 tonight, right? That's linear TV. This is the program. This is when it starts. Then the program will commence, and that's how this is going to go. Linear television has become just like a smaller and smaller and smaller part of what it is that we consume because is that push methodology where we are sending out content and you will either view that content at the time that it's happening or you won't. And the greatest example of this, and really the only thing that we still reunite around in society, is the Super Bowl, right? The Super Bowl draws 100 million viewers every year as a linear broadcast, and it's the only linear broadcast that draws anywhere near that amount of viewership anymore. I guess unless you are, Taylor Swift and the Kansas City Chiefs, she drew good viewership this weekend as well, I guess. So that's the linear side of things. These VOD and these streaming services, how do they work? Well, think of it back to our crash card example, right? We need a source. In the crash card example, the source is our VHS. The VHS goes into the VCR, which is our playback mechanism. And then the playback mechanism pushes the content up to the TV, which decodes it and displays it, roughly. That same concept applies here in OTT. We need our content. That's our linear and our ABR streams. And they are being provided by Sling, by Hulu, by Fubo, Amazon, Netflix, pick whoever you want to pick. That stuff gets packaged up and then sent to a CDN. Akamai, I think, is the 500-pound gorilla in that market. There are other ones. And then this CDN hosts this content in a distributed server architecture that we think of as the cloud that allows clients at various geographic regions throughout the country to make a pull request for their particular piece of content. So I sit at my tablet or my PC and I want to make a request back for Breaking Bad. The CDN is going to acknowledge, okay, you want Breaking Bad, here are those packets, and they're going to start sending them my direction. When I get those packets, my computer is going to acknowledge that, okay, I have seen those packets, they are coming in the order that I expected them to be in, there are none that are missing. There's going to be a handshake for a negotiation of speed, which is what this ABR, adaptive bitrate side of things is. And you're going to be able to choose or not choose the system. The ABR technologies will choose for you the quality of stream that you're going to get. You'll get either a 1080 stream, 720 stream, 4K stream, depending on the available bandwidth that it negotiates, as it's making this pull request and as that initial handshake is taking place. And the reason that I'm showing you this, and again, focusing on the residential side of it, even though it's not necessarily where any of us make our livings, is because it's an easier way to kind of lay the foundation for the technology. And this slide in particular also shows why so many of these systems are cloud-based, right? When you start talking about gathering the content and then putting together the server architecture and the hosting architecture and the storage and everything else that you would need to build your own video on demand system within your individual enterprise or within your individual architecture, it's just incredibly expensive, right? And so these type of systems don't make sense in an on-premise environment because the initial investment in the infrastructure for storage and server and compression and hosting technologies, and then the technology to do the adaptive bitrate streaming within the premise, they're just cost prohibitive for most clients, right? I'm sure there are some folks that are out there that can afford them and have done this internally. But to build your own little internal adaptive bitrate streaming system is incredibly expensive. So many of these technologies, whether we're getting them in healthcare or whether we're getting another, are cloud-based or want to get out and access the internet because that's the way that they can pull those resources across multiple clients and then move things that way. So now that we've kind of covered the underlying technologies, and as Z-band, we have to support clients who have the DOCSIS return path. We have to have support clients who have IP return path. We have to support clients who do some not DOCSIS RF return path, which we'll start to touch on in the next slide. we have to be able to support this broad range of technologies and kind of start to transition what we know and learn and do kind of in our residential experiences and residential lives to the commercial environment. And this slide really just serves to kind of tell the story that the same transition that has taken place within this residential space that we've all lived through has happened in the commercial environment. It's just not necessarily happened as visibly, right? In 1990, Library Video Company, who many of you probably recognize as Safari Montage, started out as a DVD rental company and just renting educational DVDs for K through 12. And they became a giant in that industry just doing that. Same thing with LodgeNet in hospitality. Again, a lot of us on this webinar have traveled enough that you've been in the hotels with the LodgeNet systems. Most of their revenue wasn't the infrastructure, it wasn't in the actual technology, it was in the video on demand and the content rentals. And as streaming became so popular because we were better able to store content, because we were better able to distribute content, because we were better able to compress content, that business went away, right? Nobody pays for VOD in a hotel room anymore when you can just pop open your phone, tablet, laptop and get the same content at relatively the same quality on a 17-inch or whatever laptop screen, without needing to pay the money. So these trends that we see and lived through in the residential environment also took place in the commercial spaces. They just weren't as visible to us as consumers because they took place in the residential space, and then we just kind of carried it with us to work or the hotel or wherever it was that we were going. But there are some specific commercial spaces where that transition has been a little bit more interesting. And my favorite on this is the healthcare side of things. Because right now, these healthcare technologies, and I did choose LG WebOS Smart TV here as my image because it's, the system on chip environment is really where everybody believes that this is heading. I won't say that it's there yet. We definitely do a lot of system on chip stuff, but I still think more of the market is set-top boxes, set-back boxes, Fire Sticks, all that kind of fun stuff. But this LG WebOS Smart TV environment, where I'm running all of my technologies from a single interface, is where this VOD communications and really where all of the healthcare communications are kind of headed, if you believe the things you see at HIMSS. All of these technologies are geared towards entertainment, yes, but information just as much. How do I recover from knee surgery? What should I expect when I wake up from having my hernia fixed, right? What are the potential complications if I mix these two medications? Or maybe I just want to watch a nice soothing video that'll help me calm down because I have high anxiety when I'm, about ready to have surgery. My wife is not a surgery person. She was freaking out the day or two before she had to have her last procedure. So with these technologies, and really this is kind of the reason for this slide, yes, the newer installations, our newer implementations are all absolutely trending towards HTTP, TCP communications, where it's just data passing back and forth over the network. But if you look at what LodgeNet eventually became, right, is Sonify. And Sonify is now in this healthcare space going out and offering two different systems. You have the ability to do the IP-based communications and do everything as an IP service. They also offer the ability to continue with these RF communications. So you get your linear TV channels as RF. You also make your reverse path communications request as RF. The frequency that they use sits slightly higher than your traditional 5 through 42 megahertz that you got with your cable service providers. So you need a slightly different diplexer to open that communications path. So that just does make a small change when you're designing systems, when you're designing infrastructure. A DOCSIS like 3.1 diplexer will be fine, but a DOCSIS 3.0 system that only opens up the path from 42 megahertz and below won't work if you're working with a Sonify system that's using that slightly higher reverse path communications. LG has actually gone down the path with their smart TVs, their WebOS TVs, where I can communicate with them and I can reach out, IP communications, but they also have the options within their engineering menus of being able to use any of the available 6 megahertz RF channels to push communications out to the smart TVs, and therefore be able to do communications via RF, through the LG Procentric platform. And so, in the environment that we live in today, what we actually have, and like I said, 7 years ago, when we had my last kid, we were still crash cart, VCR, analog, whatever. So, the world that we live in now, even though this transition has kind of taken place in the residential environment, the customers that we support as Z-Band in the commercial space range across all of these different technologies that we've touched on over the last 25, 30 minutes. We still have crash cart clients. We still have reverse path RF communications clients, and we have full IP communications clients in the healthcare space. So when we're putting together presentations like this, I would love to sit here and just be able to talk to everybody about all of the cool IP things that we do in the IP way that we do them. But that's just not the reality of the world that we're in. And it's really not the reality of the world that a lot of our clients are in, where we do have to understand and be able to support iterations of technology that are 10, 15 plus years old, at least in terms of when they were developed, right? They're not like 15-year-old analog 4x3 televisions or anything like that. I mean, at least not in most locations. But in healthcare, the only big complication, and the one thing that we like to make sure we hit, is patient entertainment, patient infotainment are great. As soon as you, and I'm sure preaching to the choir to some of you, I understand, as soon as you start to touch the PHI, as soon as you're doing anything that's patient health information, then we're running into cybersecurity scrutiny. And I know a couple of you that are on the webinar here are more interested in our IPTV systems and IPTV platforms based on kind of current projects that we have going on. This is the big complication with the IPTV platforms, and really anytime you're putting a management software on a client network, is they want to know what it's going to touch, what it's going to open, what vulnerabilities are you potentially exposing my data center to if we're going to run your software. And obviously, because we have patient health information potentially being engaged when you're doing customized VOD solutions for specific surgeries and that kind of stuff, in healthcare specifically, these systems tend to come under more scrutiny than they do in other environments, just because of that PHI, which is always worth kind of keeping an eye on. I was actually on a call yesterday with one of our current clients for RF systems that's transitioning to IP as they build a new headquarters. And this was the exact conversation that we were having with them. We were having the conversation on, this is what it is going to look like on your network. This is generally how your service is going to be delivered, and this is where everything will run from a management platform. And now it's one of the largest energy companies in the US, but they need to engage network design, network architect, cybersecurity, server team. There's like 4 different teams that need to be involved in the design and stand up of this IPTV system in order to support the linear television applications and the video on demand applications that they want to support. And they are a corporate client. So actually some of the stuff that I'm drawing from on this slide comes directly from them and what they want to do. But the corporate space is one that I found really, really interesting, because one of the focuses of the corporate space is just like overall employee wellness and health. So a lot of the stuff that you see in VOD systems like Exos, Corporate Fitness Works, there's a bunch of them if you really go out and look, is that the VOD now comes paired, or can come paired, with an on-site person who helps guide you through these lessons. Think of it like your Peloton instructor being in person while the class is being taught, rather than the Peloton instructor just kind of being on the screen, or whichever service you want to use. I think Peloton's the pop culture one that I can use as a reference that everyone understands. So you are seeing a lot more of these. And what we've been kind of charged with or asked to do in some of these VOD environments is, okay, we already have this archive of content, right? We've got HR videos, we've got health and wellness videos, we've got all of this stuff. It exists, it sits on a server somewhere. Can you access it and play it back as a part of your IPTV system? Or can we put a device out at the edge that allows us to access this and play it back through your Z-band RF system? And that's the kind of stuff that we're going to get into on the next webinar Wednesday is, okay, I've got all of these technologies. This is how they work. They're going to continue to expand. We're going to continue to have more of them. How do I actually design them in? And when I say that we're going to continue to have more of them, where are we going? This is from Ericsson, I believe. There's a slide on the back that covers all of my sources. Ericsson's anticipation is, and this is for cellular data, so small grain of salt because it is cellular data, is that last year, 2022, 71% of data on Ericsson cellular networks was video data. Think Facebook Live, Instagram, TikTok, streaming, video on demand. They anticipate that by 2028, that's going to be 80%. But look at the top number. We're going to go from 90 to 324. So yes, I mean, the percentage increase is going to tick up 9%, but it's taking up 9% more of a much, much larger pie as video starts to become 4K, UHD, HDR, all of these other things that are there now in your digital signage or in some broadcast environments or in certain high-end applications are going to become more and more commonplace, and it's just going to continue to consume more and more data. And as I was putting together this presentation, Z-band's core technology is we are an RF video distribution company, right? And that's not where the video on demand industry is headed. So we have to be able to, as Z-band, provide a pipe or a methodology to carry all of these video on demand technologies alongside our linear RF broadcasts. And again, that's what we're going to cover next month, is how exactly we're doing that, how that works within our system, how the Z-band infrastructure interacts with these video on demand services and these video platforms. Because again, in the corporate environment, when you're talking about patient entertainment, patient infotainment, all of the VOD content that you can do in the corporate space for HR training and all that other kind of fun stuff, this is just going to keep expanding, right? I graduated college 2007, started with Z-band in 2009, and when I was first starting, like, it was impressive when a client was putting in a 10 gig backbone. Like, most clients were putting in a 1 gig backbone. It was like a big deal to be putting in a 10 gig backbone when I first started doing this. Now, I mean, that's not, if a client puts in less than a 10 gig backbone when they're building a new building, I have questions, right? It's just the amount of data that we are consuming and will continue to consume, primarily for video, which is the really interesting part about it, is just going to keep expanding if you're listening to anybody in the industry on where things are going. And so video on demand has just taken over this like massive umbrella of streaming services and educational content, informational content, all of these, like, what used to be kind of disparate systems from cable companies now just being rolled into this like big VOD umbrella. And so what we will focus on when we regroup next month is specifically the corporate and enterprise VOD, probably with a lot of lean into healthcare, and how we design and implement those Z-band systems on the video on demand side of things and what the options are for that. So yeah, I'm excited. I really liked digging into this a little bit. It was a lot of fun to kind of go through and look at the technologies and how they've changed over the years, and how they're going to continue to change as we move forward. I also have a slide here with all of the sources that I used to put this together, where we started, where we're headed, all of the DOCSIS breakdowns. So I did cite my sources. I'm well past the point where I'm going to put together a bibliography for everybody, but I did want to make sure to give credit where it's due for the folks that I read up on when I was doing this research. So yeah, this one was a little longer than what my uh, previous webinars have been, but VOD is a very meaty subject. It covers everything from a VCR on a crash cart to streaming services and everything in between. So thank you guys very much for coming. I'm going to stop for a few minutes. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat, put them on the Q&A. I will monitor both here for a few minutes, and if I don't get anything over the next minute or two, I'll punch out and hopefully see you guys next month.